Okay, so this is going to be chapter 21 lecture. It's going to regard water balance, electrolytes, and acid bases. So first of all, the balance concept. This essentially is just restating homeostasis. Our body needs to be in balance or in a constant state. This is going to be the case whether you're referring to water balances, electrolyte balances, acid base, blood pressure, heart rate, etc. So it's just important to remember that we always need to be in a state of balance. So distribution of body fluids. Um, as it says, our body fluids are not uniformly distributed. They are going to occupy different compartments, and there's going to be different volumes depending on the compartment. And between these compartments, there will be water movement as well as electrolyte movement. So the fluid compartments. First of all, they want you to know that females um, are about 52% water, whereas a male is 63% water. And this is primarily because females have more fatty tissue, whereas males have more muscular tissue. Okay, so intracellular fluid, which is the fluid inside of your cells, is going to make up 63% of your body water levels. And extracellular fluid is going to make up about 37% of your body water. So everything outside of the cell is 37%. Everything inside the cell is 63%. So extracellular fluid compartments. Intracellular, we don't break it up into different compartments within intracellular. However, extracellular we do. So the first one we have is interstitial fluid. So this would be the fluid inside of your organs, in your tissues, between the cells. So if you were to take a chunk of liver and you were to look at it, there's going to be a lot of water in between the individual cells. Next we have blood plasma. This is going to be the liquid portion of your blood, and it should be contained within your blood vessels. Lymph, we've talked about in the past how it picks up the excess body water and brings it back to the venous system. And then transcellular fluid, this is often the hardest to understand, and usually this is a question on your exam. And this is going to be fluids that are separated from other extracellular fluids by an epithelial layer. Okay, so things like your cerebrospinal fluid, the liquid in your eye, your aqueous and vitreous humors, synovial fluid in your joints, serous fluid, so the fluid between your visceral and parietal pericardium or visceral and parietal pleura, etc. So they're going to make up a small amount of the extracellular fluids, whereas the primary extracellular fluid is going to be interstitial fluid. Okay, so on this slide, we're going to be talking about the ion levels in intracellular and extracellular fluid. The big ones to know that you really need to remember is that sodium is going to be extremely high on the outside of the cell in the extracellular fluid, and potassium is going to be extremely high inside of the cell or in the intracellular fluid. This is important because, as we talked about in neuro last mod and in cardiac this mod, if when the cell needs to depolarize, it's going to open channels, sodium's going to rush in, potassium's going to rush out, and we get a depolarization. The other one to remember is calcium. Calcium is higher outside of the cell than inside of the cell. However, it doesn't have quite the drastic difference between the two like sodium and potassium do. Okay, so movement between water compartments. You do have movement between the intracellular and extracellular, or the different components of extracellular, and this is going to be due to either hydrostatic pressure or osmotic pressure. So if you remember from chapter 20, we talked about hydrostatic pressure being the pressure of water pushing outwards, whereas osmotic pressure is a pulling pressure, or a pressure pulling in towards either the glucose, the sodium, albumin, different proteins, etc. So Just remember that you can either push the fluid into a different compartment or pull it from a compartment into a new one. Okay, so water balance. Obviously, we need to have an equal input and output. If you have too much coming in, you're going to get edema. If you have too much water going out, you're going to end up being dehydrated. The water intake is going to be controlled by a thirst center in your brain, while the water output is typically controlled by the kidney. Okay, so water intake, usually we take in about 2.5 liters or 2,500 milliliters. About 60% of this is from drinking fluids, 30% would be from foods that are moist, and then about 10% of our water comes through the products of biochemical reactions. So when we talked about the acid-base buffering system, the bicarbonate buffering system, one of the products that was made on the left-hand side was water. So our results were H2O and CO2. Okay. The regulation of water intake is going to be through the hypothalamus. So if your body loses about 1% of its total body water, the hypothalamus is going to recognize this. It is going to make you feel thirsty. You're going to drink water or, some type of fluid. The distension of your stomach is going to inhibit the impulses coming from the thirst center, and that's how you no longer feel thirsty. Okay, so water output. Water is going to typically enter the body only through the mouth. Output is about 2,500 milliliters a day. Again, we need to have an equal amount coming in as well as going out. 60% of your water for the day is going to be lost through urine, about 6% in feces, 6% in sweat, and then 28% through evaporation from the skin and the lungs during breathing. So when you're outside and it's cold, you can see the steam coming out of your mouth. So obviously we put out quite a bit of water through our respiratory system, and that is going to be a large chunk of how we lose water during the day. The output is going to vary by temperature, humidity, and activity level, and it can be adjusted as intake changes. So if you are starting to bring in more liquids, you're going to put more out. If you're taking in less liquids, you're going to put less out. Okay, so the osmolar receptor ADH mechanism, what this is it detects what the percentage of solute to the water is. So if you have more electrolytes, proteins, etc. in the water, it's going to have the effect of making your body try to retain water, try to bring more water in. Whereas if you have a lot of water and very little electrolytes or albumin, things like that, the body's going to try to get rid of water. Okay, and that's how it detects whether we have too much or too little. Okay, as far as the exact events, I wouldn't really worry about that. Just understand the fact that if you have too much electrolytes or albumin or glucose, you're going to retain water. If you have too little, you're going to get rid of water. Okay, so water balance disorders. Dehydration, again, this is going to be where you don't have enough water coming in. Your extracellular fluid is going to become very concentrated with electrolytes, and as the extracellular fluid becomes concentrated, water is going to move from the intracellular area, so inside the cell, to outside the cell into the extracellular fluid. This is going to try and help maintain the balance and minimize any potentially negative effects from having too little water. Water intoxication, this is when you have either an extremely low level of sodium or you have an extremely high level of water. Typically, this is seen with frat parties now. It used to be you'd make the new initiates drink different types of alcohol or beer in massive quantities. However, because of some deaths, they figured that, oh, well, we'll just make them drink a massive amount of water. Well, having too much water can also kill you. You end up with having a lot of fluid around the brain, so you have cerebral edema that leads to increased intracranial pressure and then can lead to brain death. Edema, this is going to be an abnormal accumulation of fluid in the tissues. This could be due to the fact that the blood doesn't have enough albumin or electrolytes to keep water within the vessels. It could be due to the fact that the lymphatic system isn't working right, and now the water can't be returned to the vascular system. It can be due to high blood pressure, a variety of different conditions. But again, it's important to remember that this is water within the tissues. Okay, electrolyte balance. So obviously, if we have electrolytes coming in, we need to have electrolytes coming out. So this picture is just trying to show you that we're going to get electrolytes through food, through fluids, metabolic reactions, and then we're going to get rid of electrolytes through perspiration, feces, and urine. Important electrolytes to know, I would, remember the sodium, the potassium, the calcium, and then remember that H plus is hydrogen, so that's going to determine your acid level. And we had used HCO3 negative in our bicarb buffer equation. So if you have too much or too little of this, it's really going to affect your acid base. As far as the magnesium chloride, the sulfate and phosphate groups, don't worry about those. Again, regulation of electrolyte intake. Typically, we have more than enough electrolytes coming in our food. However, if for some reason you don't, you'll get a severe electrolyte deficiency, which can cause salt craving. In animals, this leads to them, eating the dirt to try to get extra sodium out of it. It's why a lot of different animals need salt blocks, and that's because they don't take in enough electrolytes and they need to keep that amount balanced. So electrolyte output, obviously when you sweat on a hot day or you're working out, if you look at your clothes after they dry, they have the white salt left on them. You're going to lose some in feces. However, the primary way that we lose electrolytes is through the production of urine. So the kidneys can try to adjust the levels that are being excreted and make necessary changes. However, that is where you're going to lose the most amount of electrolytes. Regulation of electrolyte output of this entire very complicated slide. You need to remember that aldosterone is going to regulate sodium. Remembering that it regulates potassium isn't quite as important. However, if aldosterone is causing the reuptake of sodium, we have to trade something, so we're getting rid of potassium. Okay, and then as far as calcium levels, parathyroid hormone is something that is released by your parathyroid glands, which are on the thyroid gland, and these are going to increase the amount of calcium in your blood. So it will not only cause higher absorption of calcium, it will also cause calcium to be released from your bones to keep the level in your blood at the appropriate level. Okay, so regulation of electrolyte output, slide 19. This is way too complicated, so cross this out. Okay, sodium and potassium imbalances. So hyponatremia, this means you have a low level of sodium in your blood. It can be due to prolonged sweating, vomiting, or drinking too much water. Effects are you're going to get a lot of fluid moving into the cells. Your extracellular fluid is so very dilute and doesn't have any electrolytes, so that fluid is going to try to move into the cell where there's higher levels of electrolytes. Again, this can cause cerebral edema and death. Hypernatremia, this is going to typically be caused by excess water loss, things like fever or diabetes insipidus. Diabetes insipidus is not the same as diabetes mellitus, which is what we always think of when we think diabetes. Diabetes insipidus is a disorder of the brain or kidneys where the body cannot respond to antidiuretic hormone and you produce massive quantities of urine. This is on levels of 3 or 4 liters an hour. So instead of producing 2.5 liters a day, if left untreated, you could very well produce 50 or 60 liters of urine a day. Hypokalemia, this is going to be low potassium. It can be caused by diuretics, particularly the thiazide diuretics. It can also be caused by kidney disease and a decrease in the extracellular hydrogen. Again, hydrogen and potassium work in an exchange mechanism. The effects on the body are going to be muscle weakness and paralysis, cardiac disturbances, and breathing problems. Cardiac disturbances, you can die very quickly from a low potassium level. Hyperkalemia, this is typically caused by renal disease or aldosterone deficiency. So you don't have the aldosterone monitoring the levels of sodium and potassium. It can be caused, or it can cause skeletal muscle paralysis and cardiac disturbances. Lethal injection for many, many, many years was done with the use of potassium. So they'd put the person to sleep and then they'd give them a large dose of potassium and it would stop the heart. Okay, acid-base balance. This is a little bit more tricky, so please make sure you refer to the handouts I gave you guys. And if you have any questions, please let me know. So acids, these are going to be electrolytes that ionize in water and release hydrogen ions. So essentially, if you were to put you had HCl and you put it into water, you'd end up with H plus and CO negative. Okay. So that's what it means when it says ionize. If you were to put HCl into water, it's going to split. You're going to get H plus as hydrogen ion and Cl negative, which would be a chloride ion. If a acid or base is not in water, it is not really truly an acid or base. So in the cabinet or in the closet in the A&P lab, I have quite a bit of acids and bases in a dry powder form. So if I was to, dump that all in your hands, as long as your hands aren't sweaty, it's not going to do anything. However, the minute you start to sweat and there is water present, you're going to get the splitting of the hydrogen and the chloride ions apart, and now you're going to get, severely burned. So please remember, it has to be in water. Bases are substances that release ions that can combine with chloride ions. So if you had something like NaOH, which would be sodium hydroxide, you'd have an Na ion, which would be sodium, and an OH, which would be oxygen hydrogen. The OH negative is looking for another positive charge, so it can pick up hydrogen, which is your acid, and now you have H2O, which is neutral. Okay. It is important to remember that very slight changes in hydrogen concentrations can alter the rates of enzymes, control metabolic reactions. It can shift the amounts of other ions, and it can alter hormone action. So essentially, if you have a pH that's too high or too low, the body's not going to work right, and we're going to die. Okay, so for pH, this is going to be a negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration, which you don't need to remember. But what it essentially means is the lower the pH, the more hydrogen ions there are, and the more acidic it is. So a pH of 1 is going to be extremely acidic. pH of 7 is considered to be neutral, which would be distilled water. And then a pH of 14 would be extremely basic. For humans, our neutral or our normal pH is between 7.35 and 7.45. So if it's less than 7.35, we're considered to be acidotic or acidosis. If we have pH greater than 7.45, this is considered to be alkalosis, or we would be basic. Again, it's very important that we stay within this range. Sources of hydrogen ions, we're not going to worry about. Just remember that hydrogen is an acid, so the presence of it is going to change your acid-base levels. So, acids. A strong acid is a molecule that is going to ionize more fully or completely in the presence of water. So if you took HCl, which is hydrochloric acid, it's extremely strong, and you dumped a pellet of it into, a beaker of water, about 90% of it will split into hydrogen and chloride, so separate hydrogen ion and a chloride ion. That is considered to be an extremely strong acid. However, if we take things like vinegar or acetic acid, and we put it into water, very little of it is going to ionize, so you might get 10 or 20% of it that splits into a hydrogen ion, and then the rest, and that really doesn't have much of an effect on our body. Strong bases, again, these are going to ionize more rapidly, so you're going to end up with a OH, or a portion of the molecule that can pick up or bind hydrogen, whereas weak bases don't ionize as quickly and will not have as much of an effect on our body's pH. Okay, so the regulation of the levels of hydrogen ions in our body is by essentially taking and making strong acids and strong bases into weak acids and weak bases. The way we do this is through one of three ways. First of all, acid-base buffering system, which we'll get to in a minute, and respiratory excretion of carbon dioxide and renal excretion of hydrogen ions. Okay, so the chemical buffering system, again, we want to take and make strong acids into weak acids, strong bases into weak bases. On the top of your one handout, you should have an equation that says CO2 plus H2O, and then the double arrow like this here goes to H2CO3, and then you'll have another double arrow and it says H plus and HCO3 negative. Okay, the side that has the H2O and CO2 is considered to be more of the respiratory side, and the side that has the H plus and the HCO3 negative is going to be the metabolic side. So again, remember that it said we could get rid of hydrogen through converting it to CO2 and breathing it off, or we could get rid of it by excreting it through the kidneys into the urine. So H2O and CO2 is going to be a respiratory side. We're going to get rid of the acidity by breathing off CO2. The H plus and HCO3 negative, which is shown here, is going to be the metabolic side, and we're going to urinate the acid out. The third way is to make it into H2CO3, which is this molecule here, and that is essentially neutral and is another way that we can reduce the amount of acid in our blood. Phosphate buffering system works very similar to the bicarbonate buffering system. However, you do not need to know the phosphate buffering system. And then protein buffering system, just be aware that certain proteins are able to bind different groups of molecules that will either make the blood more acidic or more alkaline. However, they have a very, very, very small effect on the overall pH in your blood. The one to really remember is the bicarbonate buffering system, and then the ability to breathe out CO2 and reduce the acid level, and to urinate out hydrogen ions to reduce the acid level. Okay, so chemical acid-base buffer systems. Again, this is the one you kind of need to know, is the bicarbonate buffering system and the constituents in it. You don't really need to remember the phosphate or the protein. However, just be aware of their names and the fact that they can be used to help buffer the acid base level in your body. Okay, so the respiratory center, again, we talked about being able to breathe off the CO2. So if we looked at our equation down here, which is the complete equation, we have the CO2 and the H2O. So if you are breathing more rapidly, you're going to lose CO2. This is going to cause your hydrogen levels to drop and can cause, breathing more rapidly will cause hydrogen levels to drop and for you to have a increase in pH, meaning you're more alkalotic. However, if you don't breathe as quickly, or for some reason you're not breathing, CO2 is going to build up very quickly, and it's going to result in the production of hydrogen ions, and you are going to become very acidic very quickly. Again, renal excretion of hydrogen ions. Don't worry about exactly how it works. Just remember that if we have too many hydrogen ions, we can urinate them out through the kidneys to reduce the acid level in our body. On the other hand, also be aware that if we are too alkalonic or basic, we can retain those hydrogen ions to help combat that alkalosis. This is just a chart of renal excretion of hydrogen ions. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Okay, so time course of hydrogen ion regulation. So there's two things you need to be aware of. First of all, acid, base, or chemical buffers are extremely rapid and are very good at buffering for the short term. This is almost always a question on your exam about what is the most rapid method for buffering acids and bases in the body, and that is going to be the acid-base chemical buffering system, which is this first line of defense against pH shift. On the other hand, respiratory and renal mechanisms function more slowly, so respiratory can take a few minutes to kick in, renal can take 1 to 3 days. So these are going to be long-term adjustments. You may start breathing a little bit more quickly or a little bit more slowly. Usually it's not even noticeable, or you may start to produce a more acidic or alkaline basic urine. Okay, so acid-base imbalances. Again, please remember our normal range is about 7.35 to 7.45. We can technically live if we are down to 6.8. However, it's really not good. And then we can also live if we are alkalotic or in alkalosis up to about 8. However, the important thing to know is that a change between 7 and 8 is a tenfold difference. Okay, so if you went from a pH of 8 to a pH of 7, you are 10 times more acidic than you were before. So there's 7 is 10 times more acidic than 8. Now, if you go from 8 to 6, it's not 10 times plus 10 times being 20 times. It's 10 times times 10 times, making 100 times. So a pH of 6 is 100 times more acidic than a pH of 8. Okay? Again, you go from 8 to 5, you now have a number difference of 3. Now you're up to 1,000 times difference. So even the smallest changes can be have a major impact on our body's pH, and we can very quickly get outside these ranges. At a pH of 6.8, if you're not dead already, you're probably in the ICU on every single, medication known to man, and the same thing on the alkalotic side. Okay, so acid-base imbalances, acidosis. Again, this is going to be a pH of less than 7.35, and alkalosis is going to be a pH of greater than 7.45. These are incredibly important numbers, and they will be on your exam asking about what would be an acidosis or what would be an alkalosis. And they want you to know that it is a pH greater than 7.35, or lower than 7.35, or alkalosis being 7.45 or greater. Okay, so we have two different types of respiratory or acidosis. We have respiratory acidosis and metabolic acidosis. On your sheet, you should have a table that goes through respiratory acidosis, metabolic acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, and metabolic alkalosis. So respiratory acidosis, you can determine if someone is experiencing this by whether they have an increased CO2 level and if the pH is less than 7.35. For metabolic acidosis, you're going to have a pH less than 7.35. However, your CO2 is typically closer to normal. The problem is you have a very low level of H2CO3. So we're burning our bicarb to try to balance this acid-base issue. Same idea for alkalosis, respiratory alkalosis. You're going to have a very low level of CO2 and H2CO3. And for metabolic alkalosis, you're going to have too much hydrogen ions being excreted or too much bases coming into the body. So, grandma who decides that she wants to have the calcium out of Tums, she eats about 40 of them a day. Now the problem isn't the fact that she had so much calcium, it's the fact that she's had so much of the HCO3 negative that she's used up every speck of hydrogen she has, and now she's extremely alkalotic. The causes for respiratory and metabolic alkalosis are on the sheet. So it talks about severe vomiting, severe diarrhea, diabetic ketoacidosis, respiratory arrest, etc. So please go through those and have a general idea of what can cause each. Compensation we are not going to cover, so please don't worry about it. Okay, so this is the end of your Chapter 21 lecture. Please remember to let me know if you have any questions. You are responsible for the material. So, this is going to be your last exam besides the final. So please make sure you look it over. Please make sure you understand it. And if you don't, please let me know so I can, try to help you in any way I can.